Okay, this is part one of the Blender Game Engine Python programming tutorial series that I'm about to do. There'll be quite a few lessons in here. I've already done 20 or so lessons on basic Python programming, and that applies to just Blender render. And I've also done a series of tutorials. Also, you can find that in a playlist on the game engine physics. So you should be familiar with logic bricks in the game engine, and if not, I'll show you what I mean by that. In here, you would go to game logic, and you would set these sensors and controllers and actuators up. And if this is not completely familiar to you, you should check my tutorials in that playlist under game engine physics first. And then, because what the programming does within Blender using Python is it replicates a lot of this kind of stuff. And in some cases, you need to use the programming, but the logic bricks are very powerful. So, but what we're going to do, first of all, I'm going to set the scene. The reason I use the game engine a lot is one, just for interactive stuff, which I like to do, but also because I typically take something like this. In fact, let's just do this in here real quick. Something I would do within the game engine, I would shift to the game engine like this, and I would come over to the physics tab, and I would turn this into a rigid body like you've seen in the game engine physics tutorials. And I'll change that radius just because. And then this plane by default is static within the game engine. In the Blender render, you would have to set that as a collision object. And then if I press P and run this, well, actually it'll turn white. You're not going to get a very good indicator. So I'll show you what else I do is I use texture mode a lot. So in texture mode within the game engine, I need to have some lights set. And the way you do that, you come over here to this render button and make sure you set the GLSL shading in here, and then we better give it some lights. We have a light, but let's see, there's a light there in the scene. This, sometimes these planes get upside down somehow on me. That plane, I swear it must be upside down. I'm going to click it and find out. I'm just going to rotate that plane 180 degrees. Oops, I had the wrong one. I can't even click the plane. There it is. See, sometimes it's upside down. When you can't select it from above, it gets upside down. I think that's when I scale it. Sometimes I move the mouse past the center point, and it actually scales it down and scales it back up, and it kind of flips it over. So I'm going to rotate that on X 180 degrees, and there's my surface that I have in here. Alright, so now when I press P, that thing just drops down to the surface. Let's rotate it a little bit, see if it interacts. Well, it doesn't do much yet, but we'll fix all that up. But that kind of gives you an idea. So I would create the animation within here, and then I would come up here and record the animation. I would click that, and then when I ran it, it would record a bunch of keyframes. And those keyframes I would take back into Blender Render, and you would see all the keyframes here on the timeline for that object. So I mix and match those all the time because I might create the animation within here and then go into Blender Render and actually render it within cycles. So I switch all the time. Someday it might all be integrated together, but for now this is the way to work. So so basically now, since I have the lighting set in the scene, from here come up to here and go into the scripting mode. And I already have scripting set up. It shows up like this, but I have a file already typed in right here. It's really very basic. There's not a lot to getting started, so we'll start with something simple. In fact, we don't even need all of this, but I'll show you what this is. Just the key things, if you're not familiar with Python whatsoever, one thing is you want to make sure that, see this space here like this? That's one tab distance. So I'm defining a function called main here, and I end it with a colon. Let me zoom in on this a little bit. There you go. And I have a colon at the end of the line, and then when I press return, if I was here, see it indents it automatically 4 spaces in, or basically one tab in, and that's where these next commands need to be because they're a part of this main function like this. Alright, so this is outside of the function, and you need to just type this in, called import BGE, Blender Game Engine. Okay, and then these are just common things that are required for kind of the startup of all the Python programming within the game engine. If we want to, in fact, I want to get a keyboard, so you're going to just make sure you type that in. And this is a controller, just as just under like the logic bricks, this is we're assigning the controller to this name CONT. We're assigning the player, which is like an object, to the controller.owner, which means, I'll get to that in a second, we sign the scene, and then we're going to go do something down in here. But just check out this code and type it in first, because a lot of programming, if you're not an experienced programmer, the best way to learn programming is just to look at other code and type it in and get used to typing it in, and eventually you make small changes and then it makes a lot of sense. And then down here, notice at the very end what I'm doing, I call the function main. Notice it's back on the main line, and I call it with open and close parentheses, but there's no colon at the end of it like that. So when this file runs, gets executed, it calls main, and then it comes up here and it runs all the code within this main method right here like this. Well, but now the key is, how do we get it to run this main method, right? Well, we can do it just by doing this. Let's see. If I was just to do, I'll show you what it does and does not do. If I just press P, you see it does nothing. It virtually does nothing. It just turns that screen blank. Alright, I'm going to escape that like this. Alright, first of all I'm going to go into texture mode, because without texture mode it just doesn't work. Alright, so now if I press P, there we see it happening in here. We're just basically seeing the same simulation that I had set up. It's falling because this was set as a rigid body object, right? But I want this, so this code doesn't seem to be doing anything, except within this code I do have, and you need to type this in as well right here. Make sure you type this line in. This is, you don't have to worry everything exactly what it does right now. What this line says is basically it's looking for a keyboard event. And then you can look up all these keyboard events, and this particular keyboard event it's looking for is the up arrow key. That's just the same as the way you would do it in the logic bricks for the controller. You have the controller, you click the mouse button, and then you press the up arrow key. This line is essentially the same thing as that. It's scanning for the up arrow key. If you want to scan for the down arrow key, you just change it to down arrow key like this in uppercase. And then if it finds the up arrow key, it's going to take, it says take the player.localPosition.y and increment it by 1. This plus equals means to add 1 to the existing value. So and this .y means to the existing y location. Alright, so it should move it in the existing y location. And this player is what I set up here as the controller owner. So that's really the name of this, but somehow this code has to get executed. So it has to get executed numerous times if it wants to constantly scan for this keyboard. For the keyboard like this. So if I was to run this and press the up arrow key, let's see if it even does anything. Alright, so I'm going to press P. I'm going to press the up arrow key. I'm in the window, but it's not doing anything. Right? Okay. Well, that's because you need to have this code associated with some object in the scene. And so I'm going to associate it with this. So you have to use the logic bricks just a little bit, but not much. So down here, the name of my file, I've named it as keyboard input. So when you first, when this window first shows up, I'll show you, it shows up like this as, well, it shows up as text. It'll have something called text. Well, it'll do just like that. If I click that, that's what your window shows up from the beginning. It shows up as text, and you would type your code in here. But I've created another file by clicking the plus button, and I called it keyboard input, and then I typed all this stuff in here. Alright, so the name of my Python file is keyboard input, and I need to somehow associate that with this object in order for this code to work, in order for it to know that this thing called player is associated with that cube. So we could call this anything. We could just, maybe sometimes I do this and make it simpler. I just call it, cube object, just so I know what it's referencing. And so I'll call this cube object. Okay, like this. And then from within here we need to go into the logic bricks. So we'll go into the game logic like this, and I'll go full screen real quick for a second, and then we'll add a sensor, and I'm going to add an always sensor. Whereas normally when you're in the logic bricks within the game engine, what we were doing before we added a keyboard sensor like this, and you clicked in here and press the up arrow key. That'd be one way to do it. But when we're doing it in Python, you come in, you add a sensor, and you add an always sensor, and you click this button right here. It's a pulse. It triggers over and over and over. And then you add a controller, and instead of an AND controller like we do before, we add a Python controller. And then we link them together like we've done, and then we need to give it the name of a script. And the script we want is keyboard input. And you don't need to do anything over here, because what we're doing over here in the logic bricks is what we do in the code instead. Right, so, but you do need to have these in here like this. So the cube basically has this sensor that's constantly scanning the key, is always constantly running this code. Like, so let's go back to the scripting window. Okay, so now what's happening is the cube is associated with this code, and since I clicked that pulse button, it's always going to just keep running this code, meaning it's always going to come down and it's going to continually scan for the keyboard event, which we have set, which is called the up arrow key. And if it finds that I've pressed the up arrow key, it's going to take the cube object, and it's going to take the current local position, the Y value of the local position, you make sure that's a capital P there, and you increment it by 1. This would be the same as taking local position dot y is equal to local position dot y plus 1. This is a shorthand term in computer programming called plus equals sign. Alright, so now when I run it by pressing the P key, it's still going to run the simulation first, but now when I press the up arrow key, it should move it by a factor of 1 each time. Alright, so did you see that? Did you see that? Alright, I press it there, and I press the up arrow key. If I hold it, if I see what I did there, alright, I'll do it again. I'll run it once, and I'll just press it briefly. I mean, alright, just barely. So you see how, and if I hold it down, it's just going. So that shows you that it's constantly scanning. Alright, so that's just the basics of getting started. I'm going to repeat a lot of this until we get going, because there's only about 10 really fun, cool commands that we need to really make a lot of action happen in this game engine. And you can see that was like, how much code was that? You know, like what, a few lines of code? In fact, you know, just as you just know you're going to need these things in here. These are common things you need. And so eventually, if you just start seeing it over and over again, then it'll make sense. And we'll continue in the next lesson. All right, I'll see you in the next lesson.